We were talking to TigerIllustrated.com senior writer Larry Williams, who has been on the beat for a gazillion years, knows
Mhm.
everything there is about the Tigers, a terrific site to subscribe to, along with getting the recruiting insights of Paul Strelo and publisher Chris Ard. Obviously from the NC State perspective, this is like their big game. This is, something that they've been building for a long time to be in a position to be in the top 10, to play another top 10 team. But obviously, Clemson just played Georgia last year and they've been in national title games and they've been in semifinals. What is kind of the vibe down in Clemson land besides worrying about the weather?
Well, I think that even given that decorated history that Clemson brings into the to this matchup, all that wealth of experience against top 10 teams, top 5 teams, playoff games, national championship games, there's still an element of uncertainty, I think, from the Clemson side as well. Just as much, I think, as people are fairly wondering, okay, is NC State a legit top 10 team? I think it's probably just as fair to wonder right now, is Clemson a legit top 5 team? Is Clemson still in that elite air um, that they declined from last season by finishing 10-3? Um, yeah, we've seen Dabo 2.0, the reconstituted staff after Brent Venables and Tony Elliott leave. I think there's still a lot of questions about that, particularly on the defensive side of the ball after what was shown last week at Wake Forest with, I think, 78 pass interference penalties, give or take a few, committed by those cornerbacks. So, yes, Clemson is, you could argue Clemson is right at home in this kind of matchup. They should probably feel good about this particular matchup, just given that it's at home, given that NC State is still in some new territory here. Having not won the type of games they won like they did against Clemson last year very often under Dave Doran. But um, I think, I mean, it feels weird here as the calendar is about to turn to late October, saying we don't really know whether this is a truly a Titanic matchup that it's billed as, but that's the way it feels, just because we're still learning so much about both teams, I believe.
I think a part of that is the ACC as a conference. And I think it's clear that Wake Forest will have a good team this year, and Clemson will have a good season. NC State should have a good season too. And after that, it's a little murky. Maybe Pittsburgh, somebody will pop up. But I'm sure when the schedule came out, no one probably figured, oh, Wake Forest and then NC State back to back for Clemson. That's two huge ACC games in a row in terms of trying to win Atlantic Division. But now that they've played Wake, was it a good thing that they got a big test early for Wake Forest and then to play NC State, or how do you kind of view that?
Before the season, I actually think before the season, this was sort of viewed as okay. This is the first real test after Georgia Tech, Furman, and Louisiana Tech. I think a lot of people, a lot of Clemson folks, were thankful that this year they didn't have a monster in the opening game like Georgia, where you're you find your confidence on offense shattered possibly for the rest of the year after that game, and so you have somewhat of a preseason to figure some things out, to really get a hard look at some personnel when the lights are on. But I think the whole time this 2 game stretch was viewed by the staff and by Clemson fans as okay. Are they truly back to to the place they enjoyed in previous to last year, where they just pretty much dispatched of almost all of their ACC games with ease? Or is it going to be more like last year, where just about every game they play is a late fourth quarter 1 possession game? Um, what did they learn at Wake? I would also say going into the season, the notion that I had was okay. you're going to be going to Wake, and the fact that these two games are grouped together is kind of difficult. If that Wake game is a fourth quarter game, of course this one was. Um, what I kind of looked at before the season was, and it's kind of feels kind of wrong now, is the real game that could sneak up on you is Clemson goes to Boston College next week, and so it's like, okay, you're going to Wake, and you come back for what should be a really big emotional NC State game. And then you got to turn around and go on the road and pick yourself up and be energetic and have that edge against Boston College in a probably a pretty benign atmosphere, comparatively speaking. Um, but I think just right now, 4 games in has shown us that college football, it's always unpredictable, but for Clemson through 4 games, it's more unpredictable than ever, because going into the year, the conventional notions, and the notion that I had as well was, all right, this defense is going to be lights out. It's going to be, it's going to remind people of the 2014 defense or the 2018 defense, um, and they're going to have to lean on that to sort of help the offense and DJ Uiagalelei develop their confidence. And I thought going into the year that, man, if they can just get, if DJ or Cade Klubnik, if they can just get pretty good quarterback play, then you can win a lot of football games because your defense is presumably going to be elite. Well, here we are 4 games in, and it's really kind of the opposite. The DJ has played really, really well, better than just pretty good. And if he keeps on this trajectory, he's going to be entering Heisman conversations. I mean, we're talking elite kind of quarterback play is where he's trending. Obviously, Saturday is going to tell us a lot about that because NC State's defense is capable of giving them problems they haven't experienced yet offensively. But it's like now you're like, okay, if the defense can just be pretty good, then they can win some games. They haven't been pretty good yet. I mean, they come out of the Georgia Tech game in the opener going, okay, that's a just your typical Clemson defense. Looks a lot like the Venables defenses of the last decade, but man, they've just given up big play after big play in the passing game. That includes Furman. It
Mhm.
includes Louisiana Tech. They've given up, I want to say, 15 passing plays of 20 yards or more in the last 2 games. And so none of this was predicted before the season. And of course, there are extenuating circumstances. They've had some injuries in the secondary. Sheridan Jones has been out. Andrew Makuba has been out. Malcolm Green has been out. So you pile that on top of, you lost Andrew Booth and Mario Goodrich from last year's secondary. And that sort of explains how they're sort of in some disarray on the back end. So that part of it wasn't a part of the build up or the things we were thinking for 8 months during the off season, but that's part of the beauty of college football, in my opinion, is you never really know.
Sure. And, NC State fans know Clemson defensive backs coach Mike Reed, who was under Tom O'Brien for many years. One of the things that I, always go back to, it was 14-14 at the end of regulation last year. It was a very hard situation for Clemson to even reach 14 points, is my recollection. And I remember watching that game and I'm thinking they didn't have outside receivers. They had zero slot. They didn't use the tight end. And then they had basically Will Shipley and nobody else at running back. And then I watched the Wake Forest game, and obviously some of these guys emerged, Bo Collins emerged later in the year, but I think he played 2 snaps against NC State last year. The really good sophomore tight end from Tennessee, he had played 5 snaps against South Carolina State in the first 4 games last year. Antonio Williams was in high school at this point last year. So obviously DJ has really improved, but so have his weapons around him. And I gather the offensive line has been able to give him time. How much of a transformation has this offense been to what you remember early last year? And again, you mentioned it, they maybe lost confidence confidence against Georgia, and then they have to play NC State a few weeks later. They eventually recover, but it was like basically a 9-day difference between, even from a personnel standpoint, at the beginning of last year to the end of last year and then this year.
Yeah, Clemson in the first 4 games has scored more points, uh, more total points than at any other time in the first 4 games in the Dabo era, and I believe it's only the second time since 1900 that they scored this many points in the first 4 games. And some people would say and have said, "Oh, well, the defenses they've faced have been not good at all," and that's absolutely true. But I would contend that it is still remarkable by virtue of the fact that they were so bad last year. I mean, they scored 14 points against Georgia Tech last year. 14 points in Death Valley, won that game by 6 points. And even as recently as earlier this year, I think as of late in the third quarter against Georgia Tech, they're up, I want to say 14-10, 17-13. So that hadn't put up a bunch of points not very long ago. They had 13 points at the half against Louisiana Tech. So certainly don't want to paint the picture that it's been this just comprehensive explosion of offense against respectable defenses. It hasn't been that, but when you look at how they were doing it against Wake Forest, it's DJ not just getting time, but going through his progressions and not getting spooked like he was so often last year, and then just firing lasers downfield in really a manner that reminds you of the 2020 DJ when, as a freshman, he came in relief of Trevor Lawrence against Notre Dame and Boston College, and performed in a way that made people think, okay, here's another generational quarterback, following right in that lineage of Deshaun Watson and Trevor Lawrence. A lot of people didn't think that was going to come back, but they were ever going to see that DJ again. But I do think, to your point, the guys around him are also finally playing better. It starts with the offensive line. As of the NC State game last year, it was a revolving door because they couldn't figure out center. They started the season with Matt Bockhorst moving from guard to center, but he basically had like 2 weeks to practice because he had an injury he had an injury in camp that basically kept him out for like 2+ weeks. So his first snaps really in competitive situations in practice came less than 2 weeks before they played Georgia, that Georgia defense in Charlotte. And so fast forwarding to the NC State game last year, they're still trying to figure things out. I think Paul Tio started at left guard because freshman Marcus Tate wasn't ready. Well, then Tio was even worse than Tate against NC State. So they yank him and they put Tate back in. Anyway, they have a lot more continuity now. I think a big part of it is Will Putnam switching from guard to center and really taking to that position, and it really fits him. Doesn't feel like an experiment as much as the Bockhorst move to center did. They have a freshman, Blake Miller, at right tackle, who's still learning, but is going to be a great one, I think. Walker Parks moved from tackle to right guard, and is also still learning how to play inside, but I think the trajectory is headed up on the right side. I think that they have one of the best in the college game at left tackle, and Jordan McFadden. Marcus Tate is getting better and better. I think he's going to be an all-conference type of player in time. So that's where it starts. But it's really interesting. You mentioned what the composition of their receiving core looked like last year when they played in Raleigh, because it was Justin Ross, right? Like, who had a injured foot.
Solid, but you could tell he was not the Justin Ross of before.
Yeah, yeah, he did not have the explosion and all that he had before. You had them still trying to, get EJ Williams going after his impressive freshman season. That really never panned out last year. You had Frank Ladson, who they compared to Sammy Watkins when he got here, and who was nowhere close to that. He's now at Miami after transferring. You had Joseph Ngata, who also, before he even played it down, uh, had these lofty expectations placed on his shoulders. He had injuries last year, and
And those
only
were
now
all
is he
outside
beginning to.
receivers too.
What's that?
They were all outside receivers.
Yeah, and so he's only now starting to show some of the signs that he can be that guy on those 50-50 balls that you just throw it up to him and he can go get it. But the difference right now is you have a legit slot guy in Antonio Williams, the freshman who you mentioned, who is only going to get better and better. Bo Collins, who you also mentioned, also their tight ends. They really showed against Wake Forest that how, man, if you get those guys going over the middle of the field, it can really help the receivers on the outside because defenses then have to concern themselves with that. So I think they're just playing a lot more cleanly on offense. It starts with DJ, of course, but it really is providing a lot of evidence for Dabo's contention that he had for a long time during the offseason that, hey, it wasn't just DJ last year. He didn't have the guys around him who he had during those two starts in 2020 in Travis Etienne, one of the greatest playmakers in college football. Um, you also had Amari Rogers in 2020, who was a great slot presence. Okay, so I don't think that I think that anybody who thinks that this offense, after doing what it did at Wake Forest, is just going to torch NC State and is never going to look back, and they're going to get back to, you know, beating teams 70-10. I think that's a bit too fanciful. I think this is going to be a big challenge for them this week, a different kind of challenge because they're going to have to execute down the field. I think NC State kind of likes to try to keep everything in front of them on their back end, and so that's a lot different than Wake Forest, which their safeties are so nosy against the run, and so that basically means one-on-one man coverage downfield, and you just got to win one-on-one matchup. So I think they're going to have to be more patient and methodical in this one, probably.
And then obviously you talked a lot about the secondary. In the front seven, once upon a time I saw Trenton Simpson play running back as a sophomore at Mallard Creek, and he was really good. And it was a very memorable game. Mallard Creek played at Scotland County when they had Zamir White, and Mallard Creek had Jordan Davis. And now they're both those guys obviously win a national title at Georgia and are in the NFL. And there was young Trenton Simpson making his name as a sophomore. So at one point, people thought he was going to be a college running back prospect. Obviously, he made the smart decision in terms of how much money he'll make in the NFL one day as a linebacker. But I think he's probably the most talented defensive player. But then I would also argue that Tyler Davis maybe is the heart and soul. And he did not play against NC State last year, if my memory is right. And as he showed late in the Wake Forest game, it makes a big difference when there's a healthy Tyler Davis, which has not happened since his freshman year. But when he is healthy, and he will be this week, how much of a difference is it up the middle when you have Tyler Davis and then Trenton Simpson?
Yeah, they also lost Brzee, I guess, early in
In
that
that
game in
game?
Raleigh. They also lost James Skowski, I believe, early, so they were pretty banged up on the defensive side of the ball. Yeah, I think that the defensive front is sort of being held to the standard of best of the best. Like I mentioned, the comparisons between 2014 and 2018, those two great defensive lines, really iconic in Clemson history. Um, I think that there was an instance that comes to my head right now is the first scrimmage of August camp last month. The offense kind of had its way with the defense. They really ran the ball, which was a shock because you just assume that they're not going to be able to get anything against this defensive line. And after that scrimmage, Dabo said, the offensive line played like it spent all off season hearing about how bad it's going to be, and the defensive line played like It's been all off season hearing about how great it's going to be, and so you wonder if that might be a factor. All those grand expectations and sort of being impressed with themselves. I think it has more to do with attrition. Um, Brian Brzee is coming off ACL surgery. That is not an easy thing to return from, especially for a dude of his size. Tyler Davis missed a couple of games, like you mentioned, with I believe it was a groin injury. Xavier Thomas has not played yet. Rook Orororo has
Mhm.
been playing with a basically a big brace on one of his hands. So they have not been full strength just yet. I'm certainly not using that as an excuse, but let's just take the Wake Forest game. Brzee had basically missed 2 weeks due to the tragic situation with his sister. And so he was certainly rusty. And that's on top of the rust you gain when you are coming back from ACL surgery. Tyler Davis, rusty. I think if there's one, I don't want to call it a disappointment, but if there's one thing that has surprised me, it's been Miles Murphy, that he has not just been a total animal, because that's what I thought he would be from the jump. And he didn't start against Wake Forest. Justin Maskell started ahead of him, and that I think that tells you all you needed to know, that Murphy was not supplying what they wanted, both in games prior to that and also in practices. And so, but also in that game, we saw Tyler Davis, like you mentioned. It was almost like late in that game, he said, "Okay, I'm done messing around. I'm just going to take this game over." And he basically owned that final series in regulation when Wake was trying to drive for the game-winning or go-ahead field goal. So I don't think things are as bad as they seem on defense, if that makes any sense. I think we'll see their corners get better. I think we'll see the defensive line sort of come into its own and find its groove. There's still plenty of questions about this defense, but I tend to think this is just a better matchup for Clemson's defense here against NC State schematically than the matchup against Wake, just because of all the funky options stuff that Wake bases its offense on, and the conflict that it presents for your linebackers and safeties when you're doing that, when Hartman's doing that slow mesh thing. And then, oh, by the way, you got to cover some really dang good receivers in
Yeah.
man coverage. So we'll see, though. It's been really interesting and a surprise for sure to see this defense struggle as much as it has in limiting the big plays through the passing game.
And then my last question is, you know, I don't know how much you've been playing meteorologist this week. And, a lot of talk in the Raleigh area about the Notre Dame NC State game and the hurricane weather a few years back. Neither team could really do anything. It was unbelievable, awful offense for both teams. The game was decided by a block punt and 2 field goals. And Notre Dame, I think, threw the ball like 26 times in that rain. And it made no sense at that time, and it makes no sense now. But Brian Kelly, and their poor center kept having to do shotgun snaps, and it was just ugly football. But NC State fans loved it because they won. So it was one of those deals where nothing about the game was good, but because NC State won, then it became memorable. And I don't know how bad it will be on Saturday, but obviously veteran kicker and Potter. Um, things can happen in the special teams, but anything in the history of past history of Clemson that shows what they're like when they're playing in a downpour.
Well, they had their own hurricane type game against Notre Dame back in
Yeah.
2015. I don't think it was bad during the game as the one in Raleigh was, because the coaches and sidelines weren't standing in water up to their calves in that game, but they still have some experience in dealing with something in that category. Here on Wednesday, when we're recording this, I tend to just keep my head down and not get caught up in all the weather hysteria. I think I'll start paying attention maybe on on Thursday, 48 hours in, when we have a better read on exactly what is going to happen. So I'm really, as I'm sit here and continue to write my stories for the rest of the week. I'm not really mentioning a whole lot about the weather, but what I'm thinking about right now is more composure, regardless of the weather situation. NC State has had a lot of pre-snap penalties on offense this year. That's something they've been trying to sort of flush. I think back to last year's game in Raleigh. Man, there were a ton of penalties. I want to say like 22 or 23 combined. Clemson couldn't stop jumping off sides on defense. I think NC State had a lot of pre-snap penalties on offense. And if you think back to some of the times that I guess we started off this interview, like talking about Clemson's glory days, from 15 to 2020 when they went to the playoffs 6 straight times. A lot of instances of so-called big matchups at Death Valley, so-called top 10 teams coming in and then just sort of coming unglued because of the situation, the not just the deafening noise from the crowd, but also the sight of some real dudes on the other side on the defensive line has caused the trend for a long time was the other offensive linemen jumping a lot, and so that's something that's on my mind. But Clemson has some discipline things to flush in its own right, just from last week with all those penalties, and not just the penalties, but sort of coming unglued emotionally after those penalties. We saw Fred Davis and Nate Wiggins, the two cornerbacks, sort of losing their minds after a couple of those flags were thrown. And when you're having to take your cornerback or any player out of the game so he can cool down after sort of losing his mind, that's not good. And so I think that's something that you'd be looking at from Clemson's perspective in the composure department. So I think it applies to both, and it could apply even more if the weather situation is truly extreme.
I appreciate taking this time. I hope NC State fans are following Larry on Twitter, though I know he will poke the bear from time to time.
When's the last time I poked the bear?
And but Tyler Illustrated is pumping out the content all week. A lot of crossover recruits coming to this game that are looking at both Clemson and NC State. And Rivals.com has an all-access pass that's available for NC State fans who want to be able to, maybe check out UNC's rival site, Clemson's rival site, see some other rival sites in the network. That's always available too. But it'll be fascinating to see what happens weather-wise, how the game turns out. I think, and from the NC State perspective, I think the defense is very solid. Offense, the running backs have been banged up, but assuming they're healthy, they've been better than maybe expected this season. One thing that I think was a minor subtle change at the UConn game, and it's nothing to do with UConn's talent or anything like that, but NC State went to a lot quicker controlled passing game. It was a lot of boom, 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 get the ball and get it out, like within like 2-3 seconds with Devin Leary. And that wasn't really as evident in the first 3 games. So it'll be interesting to see if that will be the plan of attack against Clemson. There's a lot of quick outs, a lot of flares, a lot of bubble screens, a lot of those quick passes. And that would obviously cut down on the Clemson pass rush, and then also make Clemson's defensive backs have to tackle in space. So I don't know if that was a trend or just how it happened against UConn. But definitely appreciate your time. This was Larry Williams from TigerIllustrated.com, their senior writer. And this is JC Zumbo of the Wolfpack Central. And thank you. And we'll see how this goes on Saturday.
Thank you, man. Always glad to visit.